What happens when Hollywood's most enduring icon walks into a morning show, expecting a gentle interview, only to find himself face to face with a host who's sharpening every question like a blade? He came to talk about his final film. He left questioning the very integrity of the man across from him. And what started as a tribute turned into a quiet war of words that would leave a studio frozen in disbelief. The Good Morning America studio glowed under the haze of soft white lights. The cameras were perfectly aligned, the producers buzzing through headsets, and makeup artists rushed out of frame just as the countdown hit 5. This morning wasn't just another celebrity sit-down, it was a legacy moment. Clint Eastwood, the legend himself, was about to appear live. At 94, Eastwood still moved like a man who didn't waste energy. Every motion, precise. Every glance, calculated. When he walked onto the set, wearing a crisp navy suit and a quiet smirk, there was a ripple through the studio. Even the seasoned crew stood straighter. This was Clint Eastwood. George Stephanopoulos met him with a practiced smile. "Clint, what an honor to have you here." Clint nodded, his voice gravelly but smooth. "Appreciate the invite, George." They shook hands and took their places. The opening segment was respectful, even warm. George touched on Eastwood's early career, how he'd gone from TV westerns to directing Oscar-winning films. Clint, in turn, recounted memories from the spaghetti western days and offered insight into his directing style. The audience was eating it up. So far, this was the kind of easy, celebratory content morning shows were made for. But just as Clint relaxed in his chair, George leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening. "You've made dozens of westerns," George said, "and many people love them. But there's a growing opinion that those stories are more fantasy than reflection. I mean, the American West wasn't exactly like you portrayed it, was it?" Clint raised an eyebrow, not in irritation but recognition. The tone had shifted. "Well," he said slowly, "I never claimed to be making documentaries, George. Movies are stories. You want historical accuracy, you go to a textbook. But film, it's about myth, emotion, challenge." George nodded as if agreeing, but it felt performative. "Sure, but isn't there a danger in romanticizing a violent era, portraying morally questionable characters as heroes?" Clint's jaw tensed slightly. "You mean like Shakespeare did with kings? Or Homer with warriors? Every era has its stories. I just happened to tell the ones that Americans grew up on." The room felt different now. There was no background music, no laughter from producers behind the camera, only the quiet hum of studio lighting and the faint tapping of George's pen. "Well, some argue that it wasn't just the stories," George pressed. "It was how you told them. Always stoic, always the lone white male hero solving things with a gun. Do you think that maybe, just maybe, your films promoted a kind of outdated masculinity?" Clint took a long breath. "I think they promoted taking responsibility for your actions," he said evenly. "Something we could use more of these days." The audience chuckled, nervously. George smiled, but there was steel in his gaze. "Interesting. And yet, despite that legacy, you've never won Best Actor. Some critics say it's because, well, you're not exactly the most expressive performer. How do you respond to that?" It was a low shot, wrapped in a smile. Clint let the silence linger. "I didn't get into acting to win trophies," he replied, "and I never needed to scream or cry to tell the truth. Sometimes restraint says more than a monologue." "Well," George said with a tight smile, "restraint or not, you've been in the business over 60 years. Why keep going? Most people your age are long retired. What drives you to still be making movies at 94? Clint didn't blink. "I've still got stories to tell. That's the only reason anyone should be in this business." For the first time, the legendary actor's voice dipped into something colder. Not anger, but disappointment. George looked down at his notes, flipping to the next page. "But are those stories still relevant? I mean, let's be honest. Today's audience is more diverse, more progressive. Many see your work as a relic. Why not pass the torch?" Clint leaned back in his chair and let out the softest of chuckles. "Relics are things that endure," he said, locking eyes with George. "Things people still talk about long after they're gone. I'm okay with that." The silence was thick now. Even the floor manager wasn't moving. George pressed on. "Let's shift to politics for a moment. You've been outspoken, Some say your views are outdated. How do you see your role in today's cultural conversation? Clint answered carefully, I'm not trying to be part of any cultural conversation. George, I make films. I make art. If people get meaning from them, that's great. If not, they can watch something else. But don't you think your public persona influences people? George pushed. That when you speak up, especially when it's controversial, it sends a message? Clint's eyes narrowed just slightly. I'm not a politician. I'm not a preacher. I'm a filmmaker. And I've never told anyone what to think. I've just told stories. That was the moment the tension became visible. Clint shifted in his chair. George leaned forward, scenting weakness, or trying to fabricate it. And yet, George said slowly, you've received awards and accolades as if you were both philosopher and legend. Some critics suggest that was more nostalgia than merit, that the Academy gave you Oscars out of reverence, not because the work truly demanded it. This time, Clint didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was soft. You bring someone on to celebrate their work, then ask them why it mattered at all, he said. You sure you want to be a journalist, George? Or are you auditioning for something else? George blinked. The shot had been returned, gently but unmistakably. As the segment drew to a close, the camera zoomed out slightly. Clint smiled, barely, and nodded toward the audience. He looked calm, too calm, the calm before a storm. The teleprompter scrolled quietly behind George, who was already preparing his next line of attack for segment 2. He didn't realize the line he was about to cross had already been drawn. The commercial break came and went in silence. No producer dared offer feedback. No makeup artist touched up powder. The tension in the Good Morning America studio was no longer subtext. It was the atmosphere. Clint Eastwood remained seated, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. He took a sip of water, eyes drifting to the cameras being repositioned. George Stephanopoulos, on the other hand, was clearly recalibrating. His demeanor had shifted. The soft smiles were gone, replaced by something cooler, more deliberate. They were live again. Welcome back, George said, folding in his hands. We're here with Clint Eastwood, legendary actor and director. Clint, you mentioned before the break that you've never tried to tell people what to think, that your work speaks for itself, but I have to ask, what happens when that work reflects values that no longer resonate with modern audiences? Clint leaned slightly forward. You mean values like honesty, courage, responsibility? Because I think those still resonate just fine. But what about empathy? George countered. Representation? Challenging systemic norms? Clint didn't flinch. Empathy's in every story I've ever told. You think Gran Torino lacked empathy? Or Million Dollar Baby? Just because I didn't frame them with hashtags and speeches doesn't mean they didn't say something. George nodded, but the tone remained tight. Let's talk about American Sniper, a film that many praised, but others felt glorified violence and ignored nuance. Do you think you missed an opportunity to present a broader perspective? Clint's jaw worked slightly before he responded. I told the story of a man, Chris Kyle, not a symbol, not a caricature, a man who believed he was protecting something. The world is full of people with opinions, but I'll always bet on the guy who puts his life on the line over the one writing op-eds from a cafe in Brooklyn. There was a murmur from the studio audience. George's tone sharpened. So you don't believe filmmakers have a responsibility to contextualize their subjects? To prevent misinterpretation? Clint tilted his head. Interpretation is the viewer's job. Responsibility is mine. My responsibility is to tell the story truthfully. If that truth makes people uncomfortable, maybe it's not the story that needs changing. George's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table. He was looking for a crack, a stutter, a moment of retreat. He wasn't going to find one. Still, he pressed, many critics say your films have become increasingly resistant to the progress the industry is trying to make. You're still working with largely male crews, traditional storylines, even familiar archetypes. Is that stubbornness or simply a refusal to evolve? Clint let out a quiet breath, controlled but heavy. I don't make films to meet quotas. I don't hire someone because they fit a box. I hire people who know their craft. If you think that's resistance to progress, you haven't spent much time on a real film set. George raised an eyebrow. But how many female directors have you hired? Clint looked at him dead on. Ask any director, man or woman, who's worked with me. Ask them if I've ever treated them with anything but respect. I don't hand out jobs to make headlines. I offer them to people who can deliver. It was clear now George wasn't conducting an interview. He was trying to write a takedown. He switched gears again. Let's talk about the Oscars. You have won Best Director twice, but never Best Actor. Do you think that says something about your range or lack thereof as a performer? The room fell dead quiet. Clint smiled slightly. I wasn't aware I needed to dance to be considered an actor. But don't you think that stoicism can sometimes come across as, well, emotional flatness? I've made a career out of saying more with a glance than others do with a monologue, Clint said coolly. If that doesn't win awards, I'm fine with it. I didn't come here to chase trophies. I came to make movies. George didn't back down. But some say those Oscars were given more for legacy than for merit, that the Academy gave them to honor a body of work, not necessarily the work itself. Clint's smile vanished. I've never asked anyone to hand me anything, he said flatly. Everything I've gotten, I earned. If people want to debate that, they're welcome to try making a film themselves. George leaned forward. And yet, despite all this, you continue working at 94. Why, is it ego? A need to stay relevant? Or are you afraid of fading away? That was the first time Clint blinked slowly. Fading away? He repeated. I've buried friends, George. I've watched time take people with more talent than I'll ever have. If I'm still here, still telling stories, it's because I've still got something to say. I don't fear fading. I fear silence. That answer drew a subtle gasp from someone in the audience, but George was undeterred. Still, he said, there's criticism that your last few films have been, let's say, out of step, that they lack the nuance about younger filmmakers, maybe even that they cling to an older worldview. Have you considered that the world has changed, and maybe it's time you stopped? Clint's eyes hardened, but his voice stayed calm. I don't make movies for Twitter trends. I make them for people who still believe in character, in choices, in consequences. If that's out of step, then maybe the world needs a tune-up. A long silence followed. George tapped his cards. There are rumors this may be your last film. Is that true? Clint nodded once. Might be, or maybe not. And if it is? George asked, squinting as if looking for weakness. How do you want to be remembered? As the man who wouldn't change, or the man who couldn't? The camera stayed close on Clint. His face didn't twitch. His voice didn't rise. I want to be remembered as someone who told the truth, even when it wasn't fashionable. The red light above the main camera blinked again, signal for another break. Clint stayed in his seat. George looked down, flipping to the next page. He had one more round to go, and this time he planned to dig deeper, brutally deeper. Clint adjusted his jacket and stared toward the studio ceiling for a moment. The battle wasn't over, but the gun smoke was starting to rise. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the segment resumed. Something had changed. Gone was the illusion of a morning chat between old friends. The stage now felt like a courtroom. One man on trial, the other judge and jury in one neatly pressed suit. George leaned forward, voice lower now, more precise. Clint, earlier you said you didn't make films for trends, but there's a line between timeless and outdated. Some argue your stories romanticize a past that, frankly, never existed. The noble cowboy, the hardened cop, the patriotic soldier. Some say these are just myths, Hollywood inventions, stories that ignore the darker truths. Clint didn't blink. And yet they endure, he said calmly, because people need stories that show courage, that show clarity. The world is messy. My job isn't to document every shadow, it's to shine a light. But isn't that light selective? George asked. Isn't it possible that by repeating the same kind of hero over and over, you're not reflecting reality, you're rewriting it? Clint leaned back. When I made Unforgiven, I tore down the cowboy myth. When I made Letters from Iwo Jima, I told the story from the side we fought against. When I made $1 Million Baby, I showed a fighter broken by the world. not triumphant over it. And yet, George interrupted, your critics say the undercurrent remains the same, that your films still celebrate a type of masculinity that's rigid, aggressive, maybe even toxic. There it was, the word he'd been dancing around for 20 minutes. Clint inhaled deeply, slowly. I don't celebrate aggression. I explore it. I don't preach violence. I examine what it costs. George pushed harder. But is that how audiences interpret it? Do you think a young man watching Dirty Harry walks away questioning violence? Or wanting to carry a gun and play vigilante? Clint's mouth twitched ever so slightly. I'm not responsible for how every viewer processes a film. If I were, I'd stop making them. Is that a possibility? George asked, suddenly predatory. Stopping? You're 94, Clint. You've said yourself this might be your last film. Why not end it now on a quiet note before the world decides it's time for you to step aside? Clint's eyes darkened. The steel behind them didn't glint this time. It burned. Because I don't wait for permission to stop, he said. I stop when I've said what I need to say, and I'm not done. But some say you are done, George said, now reading directly from his card, that your last few films underperformed, that the younger generation doesn't connect with your work anymore, that you're clinging. Clint looked at him long and hard. Then he said, when the wind changes, some people throw away the compass. I still trust mine. The studio was dead silent again. Even the teleprompter operator forgot to scroll. But George wasn't finished. You once said, if you want a guarantee, buy a toaster. It was a great line, but isn't that kind of cynicism part of the problem? The belief that life is harsh and people just need to toughen up. Clint's jaw tensed. That wasn't cynicism. That was realism. Life is harsh, and people do need to toughen up. But I've also made films that celebrate kindness, forgiveness, second chances. Maybe you should watch a few. George's smile was tight. I've watched all of them. And one thing I noticed, you rarely work with young, up-and-coming directors. You don't pass the torch. Is that because you don't trust the next generation? Clint didn't look away. I trust them. I just don't believe in giving people torches they haven't earned. So they have to prove themselves to you? George asked sharply. No, Clint replied, to the audience. George paused, tapping his papers. And what about politics, Clint? He said finally. You've made some, let's say, controversial remarks over the years. The empty chair speech at the RNC, your comments about political correctness. Do you regret any of that? Clint shrugged. I said what I believed. Still do. I never claimed to be a politician. But I won't apologize for thinking the world has gone soft. George pounced. But isn't it dangerous when someone with your influence pushes views that can be seen as divisive? Don't you think some of your statements have empowered the wrong people? Clint's response was slow and deliberate. I can't control who listens. I can only control what I say. And I've always spoken from the gut, not from a script. But shouldn't you be more responsible with that platform? George pressed. Especially given your age, your legacy? There it was again. Age, legacy, as if Clint Eastwood hadn't carried both on his back for decades. Clint's voice dropped an octave. I've been responsible my whole life. I've put my name on every film, every scene, every frame. You think I don't carry the weight of that? George ignored the answer. Do you worry that people see you now as just another angry old man yelling at clouds? The jab was sharp, calculated, and it landed. Clint didn't blink, but his posture shifted slightly. A coiled tension, a loaded six-shooter under the table. I'd rather be an old man who stood for something, Clint said, voice low, than a young man who stands for nothing. That line sent a jolt through the audience. George's face twitched, but he went in for the kill anyway. Some say you've built a career on myths, on characters that never really existed, on ideas that never truly worked. Maybe it's time to accept that the Eastwood era is over, and that the world has moved on. Silence. Even the lights seemed to dim further, as if bracing for impact. Clint's fingers tightened around his water glass. The weight of the moment was unbearable, but he didn't rise. Not yet. Not until the final bullet was chambered. George smiled slightly. unaware that he had just crossed the final line. For a moment, it looked like Clint might say nothing. He just sat there, jaw clenched, eyes locked on George, that same ice-cold gaze he once reserved for bandits and dirty cops on screen. Then slowly, with the weight of 100 westerns behind him, Clint pushed back from the desk. The chair creaked. George blinked. "Well, Clint," the host said, a nervous chuckle in his voice. "Looks like I might have touched a nerve." Clint didn't smile. He stood up. "All due respect, George," he said, voice steady. "I didn't come here to be insulted by a man who's never directed a traffic light, let alone a film." The studio froze. George tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Clint. This is just conversation. You're a tough guy. You can handle a few tough questions, right?" Clint turned to the audience, then to the cameras. "I can handle questions," he said. "What I won't tolerate is being baited under the disguise of journalism. You didn't want a conversation, George. You wanted a confrontation. You wanted a clip to go viral." George raised his hand, defensive now. "Now wait a minute." Clint silenced him with a stare. "I've spent 60 years telling stories," Clint continued, his voice now echoing through the hushed studio. "Stories about pain, redemption, hard choices, and real people. Not algorithms, not quotas, not social media likes." He took a step away from the table. "I've worked with people from every walk of life. Black, white, young, old, men, women. You think I sat around counting how many boxes they checked? No, I hired them because they were the best." "You're twisting this," George snapped. "I'm just trying to hold you accountable." "No, you're trying to be clever," Clint shot back. "Trying to corner a man you thought was too old to push back. But I'm not some relic you can file away in a segment about problematic legends. I'm still here. I'm still sharp. And I still don't take crap from anyone, especially not a desk jockey with a smug smile and cue cards full of gotchas." The audience burst into nervous applause. George's face turned crimson. "Is that what you think I am? A joke?" Clint paused. "No," he said. "I think you're a symptom." George tilted his head. "A symptom?" Clint nodded. "Of everything that's wrong with this industry, with this culture, where integrity is replaced with performance, where calling people out it is more profitable than hearing them out, where legacy means nothing unless it fits today's politics." Then Clint leaned down and unclipped his microphone. The producers panicked. Cameras scrambled. But Clint didn't flinch. "You invited me here to talk about a movie. Instead, you tried to rewrite my career in 15 minutes. But here's the thing, George. My career doesn't need your approval or anyone else's." He placed the microphone gently on the table. "I've already made my last film, but today I make one more scene." He looked directly at the cameras, to everyone watching, especially the ones with dirt under their nails, with stories in their heads and something to say. "I hope you never let anyone like this tell you your time is up." The studio erupted into spontaneous applause. George tried one last time. "Clint, just stay. Let's finish the conversation." Clint turned his head one last time. "No, George, you don't finish conversations. You stage them. You light the fire, then blame the smoke. But not today." And with that, Clint Eastwood walked off the set, measured, steady, unshaken. As his silhouette disappeared behind the curtain, the studio remained frozen. Not a single crew member moved. Not a single word came from the host. Even the cameras didn't pan. They just stared at the empty chair. And there, in that silence, something profound lingered. Not just the end of an interview, but the closing of a chapter, a statement that would echo across every media outlet, every late-night recap, every corner of the internet. Clint Eastwood didn't just walk off a show, he walked into legend again. What did you think of Clint Eastwood's stunning exit from Good Morning America? Was George Stephanopoulos out of line? Did Clint say what so many have wanted to for years? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where legends speak loudest when they walk away.